Jim Zobel, and I am the archivist and librarian here at MacArthur Memorial, and tonight I'll be your host for this series. We really appreciate you being here. It is the mission of the MacArthur Memorial to bring all these stories about General Douglas MacArthur and the millions of men and women that served with him through the first half of the 20th century. And we, just by being here, just by visiting our free exhibits, our free education programs, research, that is one great way to support us. If you would like to support us maybe a little bit more, we implore you to join the MacArthur Committee of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation. I think you can see the QR code on the screen up there. And if you just use that, then you'll be able to join that MacArthur Committee. Tonight is a very incredible story. It's one of my favorite stories. I mean, not because it's a happy story, but just because it is a riveting story. This is of the Korean War. And tonight we are joined by Steve Vogel, who has written a new book called A Task Force Called Faith. And this is the story of the 31st and 32nd Infantry of the 7th Division during the Korean War. Most people know about the Chosin Reservoir. They know about the Marine Corps' epic feats there. This is the story of the Army units that were on the east side of the Chosin River. And as you will find out tonight from Mr. Vogel, this is just an incredible story. Steve Vogel was a former military correspondent with the Washington Post. He was embedded with an Army Airborne Brigade during the Iraq War. He's written pretty much what people call the definitive history of the Pentagon and many other books besides. But tonight we're bringing Task Force Faith, and it's one of great books that I've just finished. And now we'd like to bring on Steve Vogel and have him go through his presentation. And of course, we'll have questions and answers after the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the introduction, and wanted to say thanks for the MacArthur Archives, where I did a lot of the research for this book. It's a great resource, and I'm certainly honored to be giving a talk at the MacArthur Archives at the Memorial, MacArthur Memorial, as someone who grew up as an admirer of Douglas MacArthur. This story is not necessarily his finest hour, but his role in what happened is just fascinating, and I'm glad to share it with you all. The way I came to this story was actually 25 years ago, around the time of the 50th anniversary of the Korean War. And, like you, and like I imagine a lot of people tuning in this evening, as someone interested in American military history, I always knew Chosin as a Marine story. And I knew virtually nothing about the fact that the Army had even been there. And I did a story about these guys. I tracked down some of the Army veterans and learned what had happened to them, and the conditions they fought in, the small numbers that they had, and then the fact that they had been labeled cowards afterwards was really struck me as an amazing, something of an injustice, and also a story that needed to be told. And that's what brought me to writing this book. And I've got it done in time for the 75th anniversary, so I guess you can see I'm a bit of a slow worker. But in any event, just to set the stage for this we're 5 years after the end of World War II, and of course MacArthur is a supreme Allied commander in Japan. They still have an occupation force, 4 Army divisions in Japan. It's the early years of the Cold War, and the occupation force is really nothing like the Army that had won World War II. There's been huge cuts to defense spending, so the 4 divisions remaining in Japan are kind of skeletal forces. Korea was really on the back burner at that point. It had been divided very hastily at the end of World War II into North and South, with the Soviets having more or less a client state in the North, and the Americans having their man Syngman Rhee in the South. But nobody was paying much attention to it, and the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, hadn't even included it in his when discussing the American line of defense in the Cold War. He excluded Korea. So when North Korea invaded in June of 1950, it caught everyone in the South by surprise, and also caught Harry Truman and U.S. forces completely unprepared for trying to reverse such a invasion. And Truman, within a couple of days, had decided that the United States needed to intervene. He was having these nightmares of another situation like prior to World War II, where ignoring aggression, say in the German aggression against Austria, or the Czechoslovakia, or the Italians against Ethiopia, or the Japanese into Manchuria, had been more or less ignored. And Truman felt that a stand had to be made, and he directed MacArthur within a few days to provide air and naval forces to try to reverse the northern invasion. But the North Korean forces, who'd been well supplied and equipped by the Soviets, had little problem pushing the unprepared South Korean army back. And MacArthur pretty soon told Truman that he was going to need ground forces if he was going to reverse the invasion. And, remarkably little time, under a week, the United States had agreed to commit itself to a land war on the Asian continent. And it was, they didn't call it a war, but it's certainly what it was. So the first forces that were sent over from Japan, these were all divisions that had been drawn down considerably, and they were pushed back. The bazookas they had couldn't stop the Soviet supplied tanks. The rockets would bounce off the armor. The Americans and their South Korean allies and some other United Nations forces that were helping had soon been pushed back to this perimeter down here known as the Pusan perimeter. And by August, it was looking like the forces might be pushed into the sea. And MacArthur came up with this grand scheme, an idea for an invasion behind enemy lines, where he would land at Incheon, a port near Seoul, and by being in the enemy's rear, he could force a collapse. And there was a lot of skepticism about this because Incheon was not going to be a good place to do a landing due to tides and other factors. But MacArthur, of course, is just a legendary figure after World War II. He carries enormous weight, and he's able, by force of personality, to persuade the somewhat skeptical Joint Chiefs of Staff and back in the Pentagon that it could work. And he, for this force, he is going to use the 7th Division, which is the last Army division remaining in Japan. They're based in northern Japan. By this point, the 7th Division is stripped down to less than half strength, because so many of their top NCOs, the guys with combat experience, had been taken out to fill in the divisions that had already been sent into South Korea. MacArthur also is going to use the 1st Marine Division, which is sailing from California to join the forces in the Far East. And the 1st Marine Division is one of the premier forces in the United States Armed Forces. And with those two divisions, he's going to land at Incheon and see if he can change the tide of the war. So it goes stunningly well, all things considered. The 7th Division, though, prior to the invasion, had to figure out a way to bolster its strength. It was short 9,000 men. And MacArthur's idea was that because there weren't enough replacements available to be sent from the United States, was that South Korea would supply the manpower to bring the division up to full strength. So Syngman Rhee, the South Korean president, just sent his police force out into the streets of Pusan, and they cordoned off the streets and basically grabbed everybody from schoolboys to old men. Anybody who looked remotely capable of holding a rifle was essentially dragooned and put on ships and sent to Japan to train with the 7th Division. So fully 1/3 of the 7th Division's strength by the time of the invasion was essentially consisted of kidnapped South Koreans. But the division was able to pull it off. Dave Barr, the commanding general, called it something of a miracle. But by the time the invasion force set sail September 11th from Japan, they were ready to go. The invasion was going to be commanded by General Allman, Ned Allman, who was MacArthur's chief of staff. He was an Army 2-star who had commanded this 92nd Division during World War II. And, Allman was a very high-strung guy. MacArthur loved him. Not too many other people in the Army did. He was considered, a pretty, as I said, high-strung. It was said that Ned Allman could create a crisis on a desert island if he was the only person around. So Allman is a very aggressive commander, and he's eager to push this 10th Corps that he's been given. That's the 1st Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division as hard and fast as he can. And he's soon butting heads with General O.P. Smith, the commander of the 1st Marine Division, who's much more cautious and deliberate and doesn't want to, send his forces hell-bent without proper supplies and equipment and everything else that you might want for a land war in Asia. The invasion of Incheon goes smashingly well, and just as MacArthur predicted, the North Koreans are soon retreating from around the Pusan perimeter. The 8th Army, as the forces down here under General Johnny Walker, are able to break out and start giving chase to the North Koreans. And in no time, the entire tenor of the war has changed. It's like a yo-yo. All of a sudden, instead of being pushed down, the American forces are heading north. The North Koreans are retreating. The Marines and the 7th Division are able to liberate Seoul, and it looks like the war is basically over. And what happens at this point is that everybody's so flushed with success. Truman and the Joint Chiefs back at the Pentagon, Truman's cabinet, they agree that they should maybe expand the war aims. Instead of this merely being a war to restore the border of South and North Korea at the 38th parallel, they decide that with the North Koreans on the run, they should complete this job and essentially try to eliminate the North Korean army and unify the two Koreas again under essentially South Korean rule. So MacArthur has the green light to do this. He has the green light to cross the 38th parallel. The one caveat that the Joint Chiefs give him is that he shouldn't use American forces up near the Chinese border. There's some concern about that. China is, the People's Republic of China is a new country at this point. It's just 1 year after the Chinese Civil War had ended, and Mao Zedong had taken control of China. And Mao, as well as the Politburo, are quite concerned about the American advance into North Korea. But some of the warnings that they would put out are going to be ignored. Anyway, MacArthur is so flush with success of his Incheon landing, he decides he wants to do another amphibious landing, this time up here on the northeast North Korean coast. And the idea is that he'll send the 7th Division overland down to Pusan and the Marines back on boats. And then they'll both take boats up to Northeast Korea and land. And then that would give the Americans and their South Korean allies two front to more or less to destroy the North Koreans around Pyongyang any remnant forces up further north, they would use the South Koreans to take care of. It takes so long for this convoluted operation to get going because of all the logistical constraints and the fact that the waters here were heavily mined, that it's practically November by the time that the Marines and the Army have landed here. And by then, the 8th Army has liberated Pyongyang, and the South Koreans are moving up towards the border. But MacArthur and Allman decides, well, since they have this new force, they're going to put them to use. And MacArthur more or less ignores the orders of the Joint Chiefs and begins directing his U.S. Army forces and Marines up towards the Yalu River. And he sends the 7th Division up on this route to the east, while the Marines are supposed to go up on another road up towards the Chosin Reservoir. This terrain is very rugged, and there are very few roads, so there are only a few avenues of approach to the Yalu River. So Allman has his 10th Corps more or less split pretty quickly, with some rugged mountains in between them. And the other major factor that's going on is that by this time in November, the Siberian winter has taken hold in North Korea. It's one of the coldest winter in 50 years, and the temperature plummets in one day from 30 degrees to about 20 degrees below zero, and it would stay more or less at those levels for weeks on end. And the forces that have been sent, particularly the Army forces, were not equipped with the type of cold weather gear that you'd want for that type of operation. By mid-November, with the North Koreans up against the Yalu River, MacArthur decides to launch a final offensive that would more or less destroy the North Korean army. And he's going to have the Marines, he wants the entire 10th Corps to start attacking west in support of the 8th Army. And the problem is that Allman, by this point, has his two forces, and I'm just going to go back to that map again for a second. His two forces are so far apart. The Marines up at Chosin and the 7th Division up here around Pungsan, and even one of the regiments has actually reached the Yalu River. But now, at the last minute, the 7th Division is directed by Allman to send one of its regiments all the way over to Chosin to support the Marines, so the Marines can consolidate. Because right now they're on both sides of the Chosin Reservoir. If they're going to attack to the west, O.P. Smith, the Marine commander, insists that he be allowed to consolidate his forces. And Allman is reluctant to do that. He just wants to reach the river with all his troops. But Smith insists, and that means the 7th Division, which one day had been directed to hit the Yalu River, now has to send a regiment all the way to Chosin. They have to go all the way down and around to get back up there. And this is a very lengthy route to get there, hundreds of miles. And they're sent up without a lot of their supporting equipment. The 1st battalion to reach up there is Don Faith's battalion, and they're sent up without any artillery. And they're going to have to stake out a position on the east side. The regiment is under the command of Alan McLean. Both of these were good officers, but neither of them had any combat experience leading troops in combat during World War II. They'd both been staff officers. And the Chosin Reservoir was going to be a hard place to get some of that experience. Meantime, Mao had, in his Politburo, had made the decision to intervene, to stop this American approach to the Chinese border. And Mao had an enormous force, the 9th Army Group, that had been down here near Shanghai, getting ready, ironically, to invade Taiwan when this war broke out. And Mao orders them onto trains up to the Manchuria and begins having them infiltrate into North Korea. there's some volunteer forces, as Mao called them, are operating in North Korea, and there's been several sharp battles between the Eighth Army and some Chinese forces in northwest North Korea, and then the Marines have a big fight with the Marines with a Chinese force in this region here, south of Chosin. But those are basically a screening force. They're not. It's not a large force. But what's happening is the Ninth Army Group, the 150,000 troops that have been sent up to Manchuria, begin infiltrating behind the other Chinese forces. So MacArthur and Almond decide that this is just a token effort by the Chinese to save some face, to provide some support to their North Korean allies, but they're not going to intervene in any meaningful way. And by moving at night in very light fashion, with only carrying light artillery, almost no trucks, moving by horseback and foot, carrying carrying the ammunition on their backs, this large force of 150,000 troops is able to infiltrate on both sides of the Chosin Reservoir, which, given the few routes to the north, Mao and his commanders have realized would be a perfect place to set an ambush. The Americans are going to have to come up this way to get to the Yalu. So he's set up a huge ambush here. And meanwhile, another even larger force has been infiltrating in this part of North Korea and is ready to spring a surprise on the Eighth Army. So when when MacArthur launches his big offensive to end the war on November 24th of 1950, the word is that the troops are going to be home by Christmas. MacArthur kind of lets that be known to some of the reporters who are traveling with him, and it's known as the Home by Christmas offensive. Instead, what the Army forces on the east side find as they're rushing up here, they arrive on November 27th, and which is the night that the Chinese are planning to land to start their offensive. So most of Colonel McLean's forces are just arriving during the day and evening of November 27th, and they're under orders to attack the next morning further north towards the Yalu. Faith is up here to the north. There's another infantry battalion, the 3rd Battalion, which arrives during the day, and there's an artillery battalion, 57th Field Artillery, they're just pulling in as night is falling, and they're trying to set up defensive positions in the frozen ground. They don't have a lot of their equipment. They don't have many tents. They don't have heating equipment. Their radios are not working very well. And that night, they have tanks down here, a company of tanks at the southern end of the east side of the reservoir. But all these forces are spread out over about 7 miles in about 10 different locations, and they're not in supporting distance of each other. McLean has sent out an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon to the east to screen for any Chinese presence, and they run into a presence. All right, there's an entire regiment that attacks them shortly after nightfall, and this tiny American force is quickly overrun, and you soon have an entire regiment pouring into the poorly defended, hastily set up defenses here around the Pungnori Inlet. Meanwhile, another regiment is attacking Colonel Faith's position here to the north. In fact, the Chinese have an entire division plus a regiment attacking on the east side of the reservoir that night. So the American force is outnumbered about 6-1. Meantime, the Marines are under attack on the west side of the reservoir, and the Eighth Army has already been under attack for several days at this point, and its eastern flank is in danger of collapse. So the attack that night, Faith is able to restore his perimeter to the north, to the south, where Colonel Jim Riley is situated with the 3rd Battalion. There's some heavy fighting in the morning. The Chinese, the 80th Division suffers massive casualties in this fight, while the Americans lost hundreds of men, either killed or wounded. The Chinese casualties were in the thousands. And the Chinese, by the way, are not very well equipped for the cold weather either. By the morning, the field artillery pieces which had been overrun have been recaptured by the Americans. It's a scene that one of the medics who's arriving there describes as looking like Dante's Inferno, because there are hundreds of dead Chinese scattered around the inlet perimeter, many dead and wounded Americans and South Koreans, and they're firing their weapons at the retreating Chinese, and they reestablish their perimeter during the day. But it's clear that it's a very tenuous situation. And one of the most amazing, I think, moments in certainly in the Korean War and in this story occurs that day when General Ned Almond, flies in by helicopter up to consult with McLean and Faith early that afternoon. At this point, there's plenty of evidence that the U.S. forces are in a very dire situation. The Marines are under heavy attack on the other side of the reservoir. When Almond lands, he can see American bodies are stacked up around the Faith's command post. They have no radio communication with their forces further to the south. Their radios are not working in the cold and with dead batteries. They have very limited communication. One of McLean's infantry battalions has still not shown up. So this entire force is under strength. It's not even a regiment, and they're facing what Faith and McLean tell them are at least one Chinese division, at least elements of 2 divisions. And Almond just waves them off and says, that's ridiculous. There aren't 2 Chinese divisions in all of North Korea. You're to start your attack again, head north. Almond, who's a pretty well-known racist, also tells them not to let a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop them. It's clear Almond just doesn't really grasp how serious the situation is, despite all the evidence to the contrary. In fact, the American tanks down here tried to break through and reach the rest of the infantry up here during the day, but because of the terrain here, the Chinese knock out the first tanks using captured American bazooka rockets, and the tanks are unable, because of the ice, to get around this mountainside. They have no infantry to accompany them on this attack. So it's a very dire situation, but Almond doesn't see it that way. The next night, the Americans come under, once again, very heavy attack. Faith to the north, and McLean is up here at the position with him. By 2 a.m., they've taken at least 100 casualties. McLean and Faith decide, contrary to what Almond has ordered them, that their best bet is to consolidate with the battalion and artillery down here at the inlet. And at 4 a.m. in the morning, they time it so that they're going to arrive at the inlet around daybreak, so they're to try to avoid friendly fire. They're able to break off cleanly. McLean, when he gets to the inlet, sees forces approaching from the south, and he thinks it's his missing battalion. He's still waiting for an infantry battalion, and he's afraid that there's going to be friendly fire. He runs out onto the ice, waving his arms, trying to stop this friendly fire, and instead he's captured by Chinese soldiers. This is an approaching Chinese column here. More Chinese forces arriving to attack. So McLean is taken off the ice and is never seen again. Faith considers himself now to be the commander of this task force, known now as Task Force Faith informally. And he consolidates, tries to strengthen the perimeter with his infantry battalion. And they're in a stronger position, but they're still in in very dire straits, and a second tank attack that day fails. There's no coordination between the tank attack and the infantry because they don't have radio communication, and they're not getting help from headquarters, in terms of bringing in radios or otherwise trying to establish communication. They're kind of left up there on their own. Air supply is attempted a number of times, but the winds are carrying the parachutes into Chinese lines, and then the ammunition that is dropped, they desperately need this 40 millimeter ammunition for these anti-aircraft guns, which have proven to be very effective against the Chinese infantry. But instead, they get tank ammunition dropped at the inlet, and they have no tanks there. The tanks are to the south. The tanks get the artillery ammunition, and they don't get any rounds for their tanks. So there's just a lot of mess ups like that. The Chinese are more or less held back during the day by Marine corsairs who do a magnificent job of helping keep the Chinese at bay during the day. But at night, there's no air support, and the Chinese numbers, they're able to make a number of breakthroughs, and Faith has set up quick reaction forces to plug the gaps. They're able to hold the line, but the number of casualties is growing by the hour. And by the way, the men are unable to really drink or eat much food because everything's frozen. The water in their canteens is frozen. Nobody's getting any sleep just because of the constant nature of the attacks. The Chinese are firing mortars during the day, and everybody has to keep their heads down in their very shallow foxholes. The Ninth Army Group under Song Shilan has now, as the third day begins up at Chosin Reservoir, they're more or less in a bloody standoff with the two Marine regiments, 8,000 Marines who are on the west side of the regiment of the Chosin Reservoir. On the east side, they're facing a much smaller force. The American force now is probably around 2,500. So Song and his commanders decide that they should move the main effort of their attack to the east side and focus on destroying the army force on the east side of the reservoir. And the real key is going to be capturing Haga-Ru-Ri, where General Smith has his 1st Marine Division headquarters, because if they can capture Haga-Ru-Ri, that's the only way out of Chosin. And they decide they're going to focus their attack on the east side and then continue down to Haga-Ru-Ri and then try to finish off the Marines. So Haga-Ru-Ri is the real key, and the directed force now at the Army Task Force Faith relieves some of the pressure on the Marines on the east side. There's a couple of helicopters that fly in to carry off 2 wounded battalion commanders, Jim Riley and Colonel Embry, the artillery commander, but that's about it. They're not getting any other evacuations, and by this point, there are over 400 casualties that Faith has, 400 wounded, hundreds of dead, but 400 wounded that he wants to get out. And General Barr, the 7th Division commander, flies in at this point on a helicopter and basically tells Faith, "You're on your own." Barr doesn't have any control of the situation. The division, the 7th, the 31st RCT here has been put under Marine control, and O.P. Smith has his hands full defending Haga-Ru-Ri and hoping that the 2 regiments up here on the east side can get out. So he's unable to supply any help to the Army other than the Marine Corsairs, which continue flying great missions. Faith hasn't been given any orders at this point by the 4th night when he faces the heaviest attacks yet. The Army is now facing 9-to-1 odds in terms of with the greater number of Chinese troops that are attacking on the east side. And he decides on his own the next morning after a really hellish night, where he now has 600 wounded men, that he's going to have to try to break out the best way he can. And he has the 600 wounded men loaded into 30 trucks, deuce and a half trucks primarily. They only have one of the anti-aircraft guns that still has any ammunition and is able to fight at this point, and it's at the head of the convoy. And they have to wait for the skies to clear. It's a very foggy, snowy morning. And they find the skies finally clear around noon, and the breakout begins. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the breakout, because I want to keep time for questions and discussion. But suffice to say, it goes very poorly right at the start, as the convoy breaks out of the perimeter and starts attacking the Chinese forces. The Corsairs bring in a napalm strike, but the canister is dropped early, and some of the napalm lands on the American troops at the point, and about 15 American GIs are killed in that friendly fire, and it really creates quite a bit of havoc at the start of the attack. But Faith, by force of personality, is able to get the movement going again, and they're making some decent headway for a while. But the Chinese forces that have been left in the back start attacking from the rear, and more Chinese reinforcements are arriving to attack the convoy as it's trying to make its way south along the road going alongside the shore of the reservoir. These are some of the only shots, photos we have of the action on the east side. They were taken by Sergeant Willard Donovan, and this shows the rear guard. They're under heavy attack from both the rear and the hillsides here, as well as the forces up here. They have GIs have set up a line here to attack, to try to protect the convoy, but they're under Chinese artillery and heavy machine gun fire. And most of the GIs at this point are almost out of ammunition. They start the breakout with maybe a half dozen rounds apiece. So a lot of the fighting now becomes hand to hand, and the Corsairs are helping the best they can, but there's a lot of intermingling of the forces here. So there's quite a few episodes of friendly fire. This is the rail line that ran along the roadside here, and the convoy route is right below here. And these guys are all under heavy fire as they're trying to move south towards Hageruri. The Chinese have blown a bridge, and just to go back to that map for a second to show where that is, this bridge here is blown. That stops the convoy for a long time. The GIs attack uphill 1221, which is where the Chinese have set up strong positions with heavy machine gun fire, firing down into the convoy. And they've got a roadblock here at this hairpin curve. And more Chinese troops are attacking from this direction. The convoy is being hit from two directions here. Faith single-handedly directs an attack to try to clear the roadblock. He, again, by force of personality, is able to string together 100 men on one side of the road, and Major Jones, his XO, attacks on the other side. And by now it's dark, and they clear the roadblock, and the convoy finally gets moving again. And Faith is very seriously wounded in that fight. And by then, the convoy has there's very little ammunition left. There's no artillery pieces or any of the anti-aircraft guns left to defend them. The attack here, where there's another roadblock that's set up down here at Hudong Ni, it proves to be like the fatal moment in the convoy. Ironically, the tanks had been based here at Hudong Ni, but they had been withdrawn by agreement of General Barr and General Smith prior to the breakout. And that's, of course, a very controversial decision. If those tanks had been there, they could have supported the attack, to the attempted breakout. But Barr didn't want to lose the tanks, and Smith was glad to have the tanks to help defend Hagaruri. So the tanks are gone. And just briefly, at the this is the south end of the reservoir near Hagaruri. The GIs have lost about 1,000 men, either dead, missing, or captured. The Marines have suffered hundreds of casualties as well. Fortunately, the airstrip at Hagaruri has just opened that day, and they're able to evacuate hundreds of men over the next several days from Hagaruri. And there's a number of stories of just remarkable rescues by both Marines and GIs who try to save some of the wounded men who are holed up in huts and in brush along the side of the reservoir. Just numerous heroic stories over that 4 or 5 day period. The Marines are able to break out from the east side of Chosin, thanks in part to the 4 nights that the Army had been fighting on the east side. And with his consolidated force and the Army survivors, the task force, the entire force is able to move south and break through the Chinese positions. And the Chinese at this point have been so wounded, both in their fight against the Army and the Marines, plus the cold weather, that the resistance begins slipping, even despite having a blown bridge down here at the Funchalen Pass, which they're able to restore thanks to a treadway bridge which is dropped. The force gets back to Hungnam, and the port is destroyed, and the entire force is evacuated along with 100,000 North Korean refugees. Quite an epic story. And just briefly again, the Marines, of course, are rightly hailed as heroes. It was one of the great moments in Marine Corps history that they were able to fight their way out. Movies made like Retreat Hell. That's the classic line that O.P. Smith is said to utter. He tells the reporters, we're not retreating, we're just attacking in a different direction. And various accusations are made against the GIs, saying that they collapsed. There's a Navy chaplain who accuses them of feigning injuries so that they get evacuated, and that they hadn't put up any fight. Just outrageous accusations that are made. But this becomes sort of the prevalent narrative, and the GIs are left off the presidential unit citation that Smith and the 1st Marine Division are awarded. And that's kind of where the story lies for decades. And in the 1980s, when the Chosen Few veterans group begins forming, mostly Marines, but also some Army guys, they start talking among themselves. It's the first time a lot of the Army veterans had a chance to try to figure out what had happened. And in addition, there's with the end of the Cold War in the 90s, they begin getting more access to Chinese records that show that, in fact, the Army 31st RCT Task Force Faith had fought basically 2 divisions, and that the Chinese records make very clear that that fight was very critical in the fact that the Marines were able to break out. And General Ray Davis, who was one of the great Marine heroes at Chosin, Medal of Honor recipient, becomes convinced of this. And he, along with John Gray, who's one of the main characters in the book, an Army colonel who was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, lead a fight to get the Marine Corps to extend the presidential unit citation to the Army units. And the Secretary of the Navy goes along with that. And that award is made in 1990. In the early 2000s, when there was during a warm period of relations between the North Korea and the U.S. That's relatively speaking, of course. The U.S. was allowed to do some excavations up at Chosin on the east side, and a lot of remains are uncovered at that time and sent back to Hawaii for identification. You can see actually from this is an earlier photograph from 1950 during the fight. You can see that bridge is still there during this excavations. So a number of identifications are made in the early 2000s, continuing for quite some time. In 2013, the remains of Colonel Don Faith are found and returned to his family for burial at Arlington Cemetery. Faith had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, and his daughter, who was 4 years old when her father died, and who was a big help in the research for my book, was at this cemetery for the funeral. And these funerals have been continuing actually to the present day. In fact, there was a turnover of 55 boxes in 2018. And these 55 boxes actually turned out to have the commingled remains of hundreds of men, and many of them from the east side of the Chosin Reservoir, both some of the South Korean allies that were fighting with the Army, as well as Army soldiers from the 31st RCT. So these identifications are going on to this day. In fact, there was another one just in the last couple of weeks. There's funerals, a number of them that I've been to, that continue around the country. Harvey Storms and his sons, only Sam in the middle was alive when their dad died, and he's buried at Arlington Cemetery. These are some of the men who've been returned just in the last few years. A number of them real heroes. Garrigus, Distinguished Service Cross for he was a truck driver who just kept on trying to bring the wounded men to safety and risked his lives many times before being killed. Celestino Chavez, he was a loader on one of the anti-aircraft guns who refused to leave his post when wounded and died from loss of blood. They just found him earlier this year. I'm sorry, earlier in 2025. A lot of people have families have been welcoming them back in recent years. Anyway, I'll end my presentation there, and I'm looking forward to any questions you have. And thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Steve. That was amazing. I mean, to be able to go through so much in just 45 minutes. I really like the book in the sense that, and some of the things that you weren't able to point out, the fact that none of those guys were sleeping. It was so cold. The fact that none of them are eating, they're totally at the end of their limit when they start to make this breakout. And it's just as of a factor that I think, most people read the story, but they don't really, you can't understand that unless you've, been in those kind of conditions, so to speak. And as well, you point out the inability to get any kind of communication with those people up there in the inlet. And it was something that could have been done, as you point out, but it was just, everybody's in this hectic situation, and it's, from O.P. Smith to Allman to Hodes to Dave Bard, they're not thinking clearly, as this is going on. But the one thing, in some of the earlier stories about this episode, they talk about Don Faith being set up like El Cid in the truck, where they strap him up in there, saying he was already dead, just so that the men didn't get demoralized. But you finally cleared that up, that Don Faith was actually alive almost when they got all the way to Hudong Ni.
Yeah, his truck, actually, the truck that he was in after he was wounded, got further than any other. It's very ironic that had those tanks been there, the story might have ended differently. But yeah, I mean, the conditions that these guys were fighting in were really probably the most extreme cold likely that American U.S. troops have ever faced, possible exception of some of the fighting up in Siberia during World War I. But in terms of not being equipped, it was one of the cruel ironies of this is that the 31st RCT troops were actually based in Hokkaido, up near Sapporo in Japan, and a lot of them were trained as ski troops, and they had excellent cold weather gear, but it hadn't arrived. I mean, they were sent up, a lot of them in their summer gear up to Chosin, and so they're fighting, as you say, in those conditions with not even sometimes not even able to get a drink of water
Right.
because of the frozen conditions that they were facing. So it really is pretty remarkable.
And then when they make the breakout, most everybody's wounded already. Most everybody's got frostbite at this point. It's an unbelievable situation.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
really, it's a lot of walking wounded. There's virtually no one is unscathed, and it's only really the most serious injured who are in the trucks. And as some of the trucks are knocked out during that convoy, that there's less and less room. As more and more soldiers are being wounded, and there's less and less room to put them in. So it was really, one of the most, horrific situations I think that American forces have ever faced. And then to come out of that and to be labeled as cowards was
Yeah. But that nobody like O.P. Smith or any of those guys did any kind of even attempted to find out, what happened over there. It's just it's amazing that it was kept in the dark for so long. And we do have, a number of questions that have come in about this. And there was one that I had. Yeah. It says, what challenges did the soldiers face besides combat, and how did these affect the outcome? And number two, how difficult was it for the American commander to coordinate and lead troops when many of the soldiers were Korean, especially during the chaos of the battle?
Oh yeah, I mean, those are both really good questions, both of them. I'll address the Korean side of it first, and that was a big concern from the start when they were training at Fuji. The sergeants are for one thing, they're getting all these replacement troops, GIs are arriving from the U.S. They're trying to build unit cohesion and get ready for this invasion, and fully a third of the troops are South Korean, and few of the GIs spoke Korean, and even few of the Koreans spoke English, but they tried to find some of the South Koreans who spoke some English to serve as more or less as squad leaders. And by the time they get to Chosin, there's a camaraderie that had built up between at least some of the South Koreans and some of the GIs. A fair amount by this point had either been killed or had deserted, because of the conditions. But
Right.
Many of the ones who stayed were, very reliable soldiers. And in that situation, a lot of the communication was just by, they could understand each other by then. But the command and control that that McLean and Faith had was really extraordinarily limited, just because of the lack of good radios. The World War II equipment they had was bad to start with, and then it was failing badly in the cold weather. The batteries were dying very quickly. And on top of that, there were just some real, things that are hard to understand. How for example, the Sherman tanks that were up there actually had good radios, but they couldn't they couldn't communicate with the infantry radios. It was just they're on an armored net, and little things like that, and the fact that no effort was made to replace one of the forward air controllers who'd been killed the first night the guy who's an Air Force guy who's with the 31st.
And these are guys coordinating the air support that's coming in with
Right,
from the Marine. Right.
really critical position, and he's killed the first night. His radio destroyed, and nobody thinks to send another guy in, and a lot of the platoon leaders and as well as company commanders are killed early in the fighting, and no replacements are brought in to fill their spots. These are key command positions that are more or less left unfilled, and there were helicopters there. The Marines had them, they served very bravely, but the Marines largely kept them for use for the Marines. So there were very few flights that served the Army on the east side, and the ones that did were like the ones that brought in General Allman, who proved to be of no help whatsoever.
Right.
They could have brought in somebody to replace Colonel McLean.
Sure.
Faith, a lieutenant colonel now in charge of this task force, is he's fighting to keep the task force alive, with these breakthroughs, constant penetrations, and he has no time to plan the breakout in a more coherent way. And so there are mistakes that are made.
Sure.
And why didn't they fly in General Hodis, for example, the assistant division commander, or another colonel or someone to help somebody to guide the breakout while Faith kept the perimeter intact. Things like that just happen constantly.
Yeah. We do have other questions. Why do you think this story received less attention historically, and how long did it take for U.S. soldiers to reach the war zone since they used, was that boats? Yeah. Why do you think it took, the story received less attention?
Well, Chosin itself, I think, really entered American legend early on. There was the movies being made, and rightly so. I think it really is one of the most remarkable episodes in American military history, and the First Marine Division's performance, I think, ranks up there with the very best we've ever seen. So part of it is you had this story of heroism, and that story was known. And the story on the other side, to the extent it was known, was, it's too bad the Army, too bad they couldn't do what the Marines did, and not much effort was made into looking into what happened and why. And as you said, O.P. Smith, the Marine commander, couldn't seem to not care less as to what the reasons were for the collapse over there of troops who, at that point, by the way, were under his command.
Right.
And I think part of it too is the lack of attention that's given the Korean War in general. I mean, to me, it's always been between these two great conflicts, World War II and Vietnam, which of course are both very important. But the Korean War has been overlooked, I think, in terms of its importance in shaping Korea Cold War history, and B, the very violence of it. When you think that 37,000 GIs were killed, or American service members were killed over 3 years, and you compare that to Vietnam, I believe it's 47,000 over 10 years. So there was a really concentrated violence during that war that has been more or less forgotten. So it constantly surprises me at how many people don't know much about the Korean War or about Chosin, much less what happened to the 31st RCT. And in terms of the boats, the ships that were carrying them, they actually made pretty good progress, despite on the way to Incheon having to go through a typhoon that could have proved calamitous. And the real problem in terms of landing in North Korea Um, it wasn't that the ships were slow; it was just that it took a very long time to demine the waters, the
Yeah.
harbor where they were supposed to land, and that was the real delay there.
Yeah. In a follow-up, we have another question that kind of follows up with that last one. How do the Chinese regard the battle today? You know, was it seen as a win, a lost opportunity, or something else?
Oh my gosh, the Chosin, the Korean War in general, Chosin is regarded as one of the great, moments of modern of the modern People's Republic of China. It was seen as a very formative war, and rightly so in many ways. In that China emerged on the global stage in a big way. It was kind of seen as a peasant army at the start of the war, and yet this peasant army held the U.S. Army, the greatest military in the world. They held them more or less, to stalemate over that 3-year war, and it's become part of the I don't know the China's the Communist Party's mystique. In fact, during the recent, I guess it was the 70th anniversary or the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, the government sponsored a movie to be made about Chosin.
Mm,
Battle at Lake Changjin. It was like the most expensive movie in the history of China, and they had one of their very famous martial arts star as a Chinese company commander, and that is the biggest. I think it's the biggest foreign film in Chinese history in terms of
wow.
its gross sales. But they portray. It's part of, I think, the Chinese government's efforts to kind of portray the United States as the bad guy, as they're taught that the Americans were there to they're the ones who started the war. The South Korea started the war, and the Americans were planning on invading China.
I know.
And this is one of the ways that they whip up some anti-American sentiment. But the Chinese, on the other hand, to call it a victory, ignores the incredible casualties that they suffered at Chosin and elsewhere during that winter of 1950. I mean, the Ninth Army Group lost fully a third of its men, and in
Right.
fact was unable to re-enter combat for 6 months. And even Mao, who's not Mr. Softy, was taken aback when he saw the casualty numbers. He was just like stunned that they had lost so many men.
Those
So
anti-aircraft weapons were unbelievable.
yeah,
I
they
mean, that
truly were.
the Americans had up there on that east side.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Another question: where was the intelligence? How did the U.S. forces not know how many Chinese were bearing down on them?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the great questions about what happened at Chosin, and also with the Eighth Army. And I mean, part of it is you have to tip your hat to the accomplishments of the PLA. The Chinese really is one of the most remarkable movements of such a large force. 150,000 men at Chosin, 200,000 further further to the west, and they were able to infiltrate largely by moving at night, covering snow as they went. And part of it was just the blinders that were guiding the reading of the intelligence
Yeah.
back at Tokyo,
Yeah.
where there was just this belief that, well, the Chinese can't intervene in any large numbers because they'll be killed if they do, because our air forces will just absolutely destroy them. That's what MacArthur
Yeah.
said, and Willoughby, his intelligence chief, felt the same way. So they were some moments where they're saying, well, how come there are all these divisions up on the Manchurian border, and there were moments when MacArthur had some doubts as well, but they believed what they wanted to believe. So
Yeah.
the
And as
evidence
you
was
said in the
there.
book, Pat Rowe, who had written that book, The Dragon Strikes. He said they knew everybody that was there on the Yalu, but they, like you said, they just didn't believe they were coming in. And MacArthur believed that they're only volunteers, at that point. And then, like you said earlier, with Allman saying there's not 2 divisions of Chinese in the whole country, they weren't going to see it,
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah.
Let's see what else we
Absolutely.
got. Looks like there's one more. If the reservoir was frozen, was any thought ever given to the army on the east moving across the reservoir to join the Marines on the west?
Yes, there were a couple of reasons why they didn't do that. One was they weren't sure that the ice would hold a deuce and a half truck with 30, 40 wounded soldiers in the back. That was in the back of the truck. The other thing was the reservoir. There was a very steep bank, really running all along the reservoir, so it would have been basically impossible along that east side for the trucks to get down to the ice.
Yeah.
Maybe you could have gotten some jeeps down there, possibly, but those were the 2 main reasons. It was just not possible to get the trucks on the ice there, and then again there was that worry that if they did, they would fall through the ice, because even though the reservoir was frozen, there were places where streams were coming in where it wasn't quite frozen.
Yeah.
So that it basically just wasn't a feasible option.
Yeah, I think you pointed out that once you got to the center of the ice, it was pretty thick there, but there towards those coastal things, people were falling through at that point.
Yeah, there were places where soldiers were falling through even without vehicles.
Yeah. How do you think that maybe Chosin factors in Truman's eventual firing of MacArthur?
It certainly it broke the myth of MacArthur's omniscience, which after Inchon was just this guiding force in Washington. I mean, MacArthur was untouchable after Inchon. It was such a brilliant success, and the Joint Chiefs were cowed by that. Even George C. Marshall, just one of the great American commanders of all time, he doesn't really challenge MacArthur. It certainly, I don't think it's so much, it was, the military disaster there, I don't think was really what turned Truman on MacArthur. He was
No,
always
I don't think so either. Yeah.
skeptical of him to start with. It was more his willful disobedience of, orders as Truman is trying to work on perhaps a negotiated settlement, and MacArthur is issuing these proclamations or
Yes.
giving interviews
Yes.
where he's basically saying there's no substitute for victory, and appeasement, you can't appeasement with the Chinese communists would be traitorous, things like that. I think that's really what just made Truman decide to pull the switch.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we really appreciate you being here tonight. I implore everybody who's watching to read this book. It is really a great and riveting story. Like I said, I went from cover to cover on it. It can be quite depressing at times just because it is not a happy story, but it is one of the greats. And I think you did a great job with it, Steve. And we really appreciate you being here tonight.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Jim. I really appreciate that.
Well, we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight, and we will hopefully see you the next time.